How's it going, you guys? So in this video, I want to answer the question, is overtraining a myth? Okay, so first and foremost, in general, what most people refer to as overtraining, all of the symptoms of overtraining also are symptoms of undereating, okay? So typically, it's these mainstream exercise gurus who are saying overtraining is not a myth. You got to watch out for overtraining. You've got to periodize your program. You've got to follow all the principles that I was taught in college to maximize your gains and minimize your stress. You've got to follow my program. You've got to follow a program that validates my college education, which, by the way, I have a college education. I have over 14 different strength and conditioning and exercise physiology books around here, laying around in my room. But basically, overtraining cannot exist. Overtraining has to exist, because if you could just train to failure on a regular basis and make gains consistently over time, or if you could just go balls to the wall, every day and maybe auto-regulate as you go along, kind of like the book Squat Every Day recommends in regard to powerlifting, or what most traditional Muay Thai camps in Thailand generally do, or even Kyokushin karate, or even a lot of the jiu-jitsu guys that I know at my gym that are instructors and world-class athletes. All of these people tell me you adapt eventually and that you can make gains consistently over time. And if you start to feel super sore, tired, take some time off, do some foam rolling, active recovery. But if it's possible to do all the things that all these people I just mentioned are doing, if it's possible to go balls to the wall on a regular basis and auto-regulate, then that means all of these exercise physiology gurus are not needed. That means you don't really have to follow a 5-3-1 program. You don't have to buy Starting Strength. You don't have to buy Mark Rippetoe's program. You don't have to buy Jim Rindler's program. Don't have to buy Mike Israetel's program. Don't have to buy Chad Wesley Smith's program. You don't have to buy any of these, college-educated exercise physiology gurus' programs. Okay? If overtraining is a myth, then all of these people that are making these really in-depth, complicated videos on YouTube, these people are not needed. You don't need to pay them money to learn how to periodize your training and how to follow scientific training principles. So imagine a world where overtraining doesn't exist and you're able to squat to a max every day and make consistent progress, like hundreds of people actually report doing, including myself. I put 40 pounds on my pause bench in 2 weeks by hitting rep maxes and strength maxes, depending on how I feel for that day, every single day for 2 weeks. I went from, at the beginning of the program, 235 for a 1 rep max on bench press, pause bench, to 275 pause bench, 1 rep max. And at that time, I had only done 245 ever. And at the same time, I was also on a ketogenic diet. And I was training jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai 4 times a week at that time. All of these things are, mainstream health exercise gurus say you can't do. You'll find when you actually experiment with things and you find other people who have, that the vast majority of these scientifically validated concepts are all nonsense. And I'm not even going to begin to list all of these things, because most people are going to watch this with a bias and they're automatically going to think that I'm full of crap. But I'll list them anyway. This idea that you need vitamin C in your diet on a regular basis to prevent scurvy. This idea that you need to eat plant foods for some polyphenols or nutrients that they think you can't get in meat. This idea that you need carbohydrates in order to fuel exercise, especially in amounts over 100 grams a day, regardless of your body weight. Especially for powerlifting, you think you need carbs for powerlifting. And I can go on and on. And I can list examples for why these things are wrong. This idea that you're going to hit this idea of overtraining by squatting to a max every day, and then eventually you're going to lose strength. These things are not true in practice. They're only true in the mental land of science and exercise physiology and all these things, which I'm not saying are completely wrong or are bad or anything. I'm just saying most of these concepts don't hold up to practical scrutiny. Anyway, so in regards to overtraining, so you have the Bulgarian method. Hundreds of people, they're able to squat to a max every day and also bench to a max every day. Typically, you'll hear people say deadlifting you can't do. And they keep experiencing gains over time. I find even just 3 times a week, following kind of like a starting strength type of program where you do squat, bench, and maybe a power clean 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you do it to failure, just one set to failure, compared to the 5x5 program where you hit a heavy set of 5, like a 5 set of 5 straight through, work up to a 5 rep max on all these days, and I find I can hit PRs every single time. And I know people who have done this all the way up to a 600-pound deadlift. So the reason why you don't see a lot of people saying this is because they were taught otherwise, and they're scared of maxing out, and they think they're going to die if they max out. You hear this all the time. And that's why, at least in the powerlifting world, you'll see this kind of, you won't see people doing this program and making the fast gains that you could. Okay. Then we have in the martial arts community of overtraining. So in my gym, most of the instructors from Brazil say that you can train 2 to 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times a day, 5 to 6 days a week on a regular basis. And basically you're going to feel like trash for the first, 2 weeks to 4 months, depending on how unconditioned you are. Somebody who's been athletic most of their life will adapt to that type of training within a month. But you'll feel like trash at first, but eventually your body will adapt, is what they say. And they're not college educated. They're just people who trained in Brazil, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and they were trained traditionally. And they say even if, you're an American and you haven't been trained in Jiu-Jitsu, that you could still adapt. You're not going to die. And they say if you start to feel injured or something like that, just do more float rolling and lighter training for a while. But lots of people think they just have to take a complete break off. And active recovery complete recovery is the worst thing you can do, because then you actually get less mobile, you get more stiff, you get more sore, and it puts you at more of a risk of injury. So then you have Kyokushin, which is a form of karate. It's hard style. Traditionally, I was just reading a book by Judd Reed. He's talking about his training in Japan, where he actually trained under Mas Oyama, one of the godfather of Kyokushin karate, who has video footage of him wrestling bulls. And for 3 years, they do this hard training where they're doing crazy conditioning and sparring every single day, like 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 straight years. And then it's all to prepare them for 100-man kumate, which is basically full contact sparring without punches to the face, just kicks to the face, where you just spar a fresh guy over and over again, just consecutively, where you don't get any rest, but you face 100 fresh people over and over again. So Kyokushin karate, to me, and again, I was reading the book and he was talking about how for the first 3 months of him doing that kind of training, he felt horrible. Could hardly move his legs. He could hardly sleep some nights. But eventually, after 3 months, his body completely adapted. He said for the first 2 weeks, it was terrible. He started feeling a little bit better after the first 2 weeks, but he was still always fucked up. After 3 months passed, he completely adapted to it. And he said he was like it was like flipped a switch, turned superhuman. And that is consistent with all of the things I've heard. Squat every day. They talk about John Bros, this powerlifting coach who had his athletes just from the get-go, even people who are not trained previously and not athletic, couch potatoes, squat to a max every day, or a training max at that point, start them slowly. Clean and jerk and snatch to a max every single day, or a training max when they first start. And after a while, he says you hit this thing called the dark times, where basically you experience, after months and months of training, you experience a plateau where you feel like super tired and you're not making gains. You might even be regressing. And he says if you just keep bulldozing through, for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, eventually your body super compensates and reaches this like brand new level where it could just take on any amount of workload. And you're just going to have to read that book, Squat Every Day, and then read through John Bros' articles and interviews. And then there's another guy, Chaos and Pain blog from early, like 2012. Old stuff. Forgot the guy's name. But he also used to talk about overtraining, how it's a myth, and if you just dedicate yourself to adapting to this everyday hardcore workload, that you reach these superhuman gains that most people think is impossible, but it's really just this idea of overtraining that prevents you from getting there. So, and then there was this the first guy to deadlift over 900 pounds or whatever in the early 1900s. I forgot his name. It's Peoples. He was a powerlifter. I think it was Greg Peoples. Something Peoples. But he was a farmer in the early 1900s. If you have family in farming or whatever, I have family that own ranches and stuff. They're walking miles every day, sometimes sprinting every day, jogging every day, depending on what they're doing, chasing down animals or whatever, lifting bales of hay and like bales of corn and things like that. And, anyway, hardcore training every single day as a farmer. And obviously can't just be like, oh, I don't want to overtrain, so I'm going to take a week off. They train hardcore, balls to the wall every day, and they adapt to it. Anyway, this Peoples guy, he first man to deadlift over 900 pounds. His program was different types of deadlifts to a max every day. And I think he did like block pulls, basically the equivalent of block pulls, basically rack pulls, where you deadlift shorter ranges of motion, full deadlifts on a regular basis, deficit deadlifts, different variations of deadlifts on every single day to either a super heavy set or a max. And that was how he deadlifted 900 pounds in the early 1900s before steroids. Another good example. So one of my best friends, he's a lieutenant in the Army now. And I actually was helping to train him for his basic training so he could score really high on his test. He got lieutenant, which is really good. And he was telling me about about 3 months or whatever, basic training. He was telling me that basically every single day he had to run, I forgot how long. I think it was miles at a time. It was like I think 4 to 8 miles a day. It was probably way more than that, but holding a rucksack, he said, was like 100 pounds. Rucksack, just think of it as a backpack with a ton of bricks. So carrying like 100 pounds on his back, doing jogs and long walks and hikes for miles and miles every single day. And he was sleep deprived. And he was telling me how they would wake him up in the middle of their sleep throughout the night and to do a bunch of push-ups and to just stand to just stand randomly for random amounts of time in the middle of sleep. And if they moved, they'd have to do a bunch of push-ups in the middle of their sleep. So they were doing all this stuff for 3 months while sleep deprived, with like the worst sleeping conditions, waking up in the middle of their sleep so they can do all these push-ups and things. And then, walking for miles a day with their rucksack, and then doing all sorts of calisthenics and things. And because of the recent, let's just say events, if what I'm talking about, they had to keep 6 feet away from each other at all times, except for sleeping and showering, apparently. So they weren't able, it was kind of dumb, but they weren't able to do the hand-to-hand combat, that like the grappling, the jiu-jitsu and stuff. But this is standard training either way. So imagine without the current events that recently happened. Don't want to get censored from this video or whatever, so I'm not going to say what it was. But basically, you do all this training with grappling and combat and sparring on a regular basis, to prepare them for the military, to prepare them for warfare. And on top of that, the food wasn't that great, not in basic training at least. He was telling me it was meals ready to eat and more carb-based foods, and they're eating very little protein. I guarantee you they weren't getting the 1 gram per pound of lean mass that I generally recommend to people. So, what does that say? Well, that says military, they're defying all the odds of exercise science. And generally, this generally lasts around 3 months or so. I'm off with the time, but I think it's around 3 months at a time. Then you have, Jocko Willink, you hear all these like Navy SEALs talk about buds and how it's like the most intense training ever. And they say, how do you get through that? And their answer is, you just get through it. Your body adapts. So another thing, my best friend who got the lieutenant ranking and went through this basic training was telling me about it. He also told me that because he was always sleep deprived and he had to do all this stuff, he said that he noticed after he got out of basic training that he no longer needs as much sleep. He said he can get by on 4 hours of sleep, no problem. And his body kind of just adapted to it, to where he wakes up after 4 hours of sleep and he's fully functional. He doesn't feel tired, doesn't feel like he's lax recovery or anything like that. And so, to me, that again reinforces what I'm observing as how the body really adapts. I don't see the body as having this limited capacity to adapt, where you can only train 2, 3, 4 times a week. You need exactly 8 hours of sleep. You need exactly this many calories, this many carbs, and blah, blah, blah. What I see is an extremely adaptive organism. This newer idea of hormesis, not just radiation hormesis or whatever, the basic biochemical hormesis, but more so any stress you put the body through, for the most part, with some exceptions, obviously. As long as you're not physically like hurting, like breaking your bones, melting your body with radiation. But the body will adapt over time. The thing is, you're going to feel like trash at first. Oh, one more example. People in prison. Okay, you always hear these people who came out of jail or whatever, came out of prison. They talk about how, they would train hard all the time. And sure, they're eating regular meals and things, but the meals weren't usually that great of quality. They're always surrounded by all this stress, and their life was always threatened on a regular basis. They might be sleeping and, risking the threat of dying, of someone stabbing them to death or something. They had all this hard training in the worst recovery situations, other than they did have a standardized routine for diet, and they say that some people say, depending on where they were, they're able to sleep on a regular basis, but they are training all the time. They were doing all the push-ups, the calisthenics, And then some places they had weights where they'd be doing the weights, going balls to the wall on a regular basis. And their food was, they were not getting the amount of protein. Again, 1 gram per pound of body weight, or per pound of lean mass. They're probably getting 0.5 maybe. And it was mostly like super processed and whatnot. But they still made it work. They always report, being leaner than when they came in, and then also being about 40 pounds heavier or more. And most of them say this idea of overtraining, at least the way that we see it, um, you know, is, first of all, it's a luxury to think about that. And second of all, it's a myth and cannot exist based on what they saw in prison or whatever. And so when you look at practical reality, the people who actually put it to the test, who actually went through the training, you see that most of the science doesn't add up. And I see the same thing with things like keto. But you'll hear a lot of people who just couldn't tolerate the first 3 months, didn't supplement sodium and stuff like that. Obviously, they're not going to be able to train hard on keto. And they don't want to believe it takes like 3 months for your body to fully adapt. But that's not really important. The same thing with vegetables. They're just so attached to this idea we need plant foods to survive and all this crap. And it's just not true. It's not grounded in real proof or anything like that. It's mental mumbo jumbo. This idea of polyphenols and things. Carbs, there is a little bit more evidence to that. And that, again, is fine if you disagree. Plant foods, I think, is kind of dumb. Anyway, you also have Sylvie. Sylvie, what was her name? Sylvie Itu. She's a Muay Thai fighter. She was one of the first Americans to have over 100 fights in Thailand. She now has almost 300 fights in Thailand. She's a world-class Muay Thai fighter from America. She's like 40 years old, still fighting at an elite level in Thailand. And she has blogs about overtraining being a myth based on her experiences. She's an elite world-class Muay Thai fighter. She would not have gone to that level if she believed in overtraining. And she talks about how all the Americans that come to Thailand to train, that they can't adapt to the vigorous, high-frequency, high-intensity Muay Thai training routine that the Thais do. And how everybody says, oh, the Thais were born into the training and blah, blah, blah. But what she found is it's just their mentality is weak. And they're usually partying, staying out late and drinking, and they're just not dedicated. And she says, basically, again, it reinforces all this other stuff, that it sucks for the first month or so, but you adapt to it over time. And interestingly enough, she also, since 2018, she's been on a ketogenic diet, training Muay Thai, fighting at an elite level, and she does alternate day fasting, which is insane because it goes completely against what most mainstream exercise science people will say. So she does 1 day of eating keto and then 1 day of fasting. And she says 8 out of 9 of her fights as of like early 2020 was done fasting. 8 out of 9 of her fights since 2018 was done fasting. Or actually, since 2019. It was since she started the fasting or whatever. 8 out of 9 of her fights were done fasting on a fasted day. Completely fasted. So, and she says she has more energy. But she says the key was sodium, because she wasn't supplementing with electrolytes at first, that she started running into problems. But then when she started to supplement like 2 teaspoons of salt a day, she was able to do the alternate day fasting, and she didn't change anything in her training. And if you look up her fights from the time when she started the fasting and keto, you'll actually see that, if anything, it looks like she's more aggressive and has more energy and endurance since she started the keto and fasting. But she's been doing it, training in Muay Thai or in Thailand for like 8 years, maybe more now. And she's like 40 something years old now. She's defying all the general ideas of overtraining and even, keto and carbs are necessary and all this stuff. So I'm not saying that science is um, like useless. I'm not saying that you shouldn't read exercise science books. I think you need to, because there's a lot of bullshit out there that will prevent you from reaching health. It will prevent you from reaching your goals, your exercise goals. It'll it'll impede your progress. It's important to understand basic exercise science, but it's also just a horrible idea to believe that everything you read in the scientific literature and in your college education and all these things, it's a very bad idea to assume that everything you learn in college and whatnot is a fact. That, oh, overtraining is a fact. I learned it in college. I learned it from this college educated individual, this PhD professor, in my exercise physiology book, yada yada. Because in practicality, it's not true. It doesn't hold up. In marathon training, that's one thing. But in powerlifting and MMA and Muay Thai and Jiu Jitsu, it's a completely different story. This overtraining idea came out of the marathon training group, like the community, where basically they're nonstop, like running over 4 hours with no stop. So imagine doing Muay Thai rounds. Muay Thai rounds last anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes at a time. Okay, if we're talking competition rounds, usually 20 minutes total, and you get like 1 minute rest in between rounds. Training for Muay Thai, you're not just running, at the highest sustainable intensity for 4 hours straight. Most of the ultra marathon runs and marathon runs, they're a minimum of 4 hours where we see this overtraining thing. But usually it's the longer ones, the 8-hour run, the 6-hour runs, the 8-hour runs, the 20-hour runs. Could you imagine running for 20 hours straight? Like, that is totally different than like this idea that if you max out on squats once every single day, you're gonna like overtrain. And really look up the history of this concept of overtraining. It comes from the marathon running group, and they actually see hormonal changes. Women lose their periods and things like that. But again, you know, it requires a lot of calories to sustain your weight. Most of those people have hardly any body fat to draw calories from if they don't keep up with their caloric intake. Also, sodium's plays a big role in that. Stephen Finney at Verta Health has a whole article about how adrenal fatigue seems to actually just be hyponatremia, and that runs rampant in these marathon runners. So, yeah, it just makes no sense. It doesn't add up to the practical application of it. So there's a couple things to consider though, and if you've made it this far, I appreciate it. I mean, I hope so. I think this video is extremely valuable. People don't have the concentration it takes to watch a video like this, unfortunately. And then most people think it's bullshit anyway, so they won't think it's worth watching. It's ridiculous. But the thing you have to understand is it's gonna suck at first, because this is the thing. So just like with keto, the first couple weeks suck. So with training, you're gonna see performance increase the first week. Then you're gonna feel like trash if you do it every day. You take 1 day of active recovery. Usually, I think 2 to 3 days is a good time. Like about 2 days is good enough. But making sure you do stretching and foam rolling, maybe do a hot tub, get a massage, eat some calorically dense foods or something like that. You'll feel better. Get good sleep, but keep training hard. what you'll find is an increase up to about 3 weeks. You're going to feel mentally exhausted because you just spend every single day you've been training hard and you just want a mental break from it. That doesn't necessarily mean you're overtraining. You might see a performance decrease because you're so exhausted past a certain point. Exhaustion happens with hard training. It doesn't mean you're overtraining. It doesn't mean you're going to die. It just means, dude, you've been exerting yourself on a regular basis hard. You're going to be tired. Duh. People who do desk jobs on a regular basis get tired. Does it mean they're overtraining? By the time they get home, they're like exhausted. No, it's mental exhaustion. And also because you're training your body to adapt to sitting in a sedentary space all day. So you're going to feel sore. You're going to feel like trash. You're going to feel exhausted. But I find full rest days make me feel more tired. Full rest days make me feel more sore. And the more I rest, the more I want to rest. I get lazy after a while. But you're going to feel like trash. You're going to feel sore. You're going to feel exhausted. But most of these people that see the other side, they tend to say your body adapts. And it does. Your body will adapt. So you get really strong at first. You get a performance increase. But the key is auto-regulation. Don't stop training if you start to feel sore and stuff. But lower the intensity and the volume. But keep going high frequency. Push yourself as much as you can, but without injuring yourself. Don't have like planned days where you just don't do anything. Just keep going, play it day by day, but stay consistent. And as long as you don't push yourself, do grinders and powerlifting. As long as you're not like going and the other thing is how you feel is a lie. That's a John Bros quote. I've noticed on days where I feel like trash, but I still go to the gym, usually I actually hit new PRs on my lifts. I'll hit a new record. Or like those would be the days where I actually hit a new record when I feel like trash for some reason. And jiu-jitsu, I'm like tapping people out that I usually have a hard time with, which is interesting. So a lot of times you feel like trash, and that's actually a sign that that's actually a day where you want to push it hard. So there's a lot more to this than most people think. But as long as you're managing your sore muscles, your sore joints and things, you're not going like stupid. You're using common sense. Then you can generally push yourself a lot harder than you think. So with this information, what this should do is give you the freedom to train as hard as you want to train on a more regular basis. And if you don't have motivation to train, then think of motivation as a skill that you've got to develop. It has nothing to do with like overdoing it. Know